When you were 7, a summer lasted forever. A single afternoon held enough space for an entire adventure. The walk to a creek, the discovery of a frog, the long argument about whose turn it was, the slow dissolve of daylight into evening. A week contained more lived experience than some months contain now. A year was so vast you could not see the other end of it. That was not nostalgia. That was not the golden haze of childhood memory softening the edges. That was physics, the same brain, processing the same 24-hour days through a system that has physically changed in at least 4 measurable ways since then. Time did not speed up. A second is still a second. A year is still 365 days. What changed is inside your head, and every part of it is specific, documented, and more interesting than the assumption that aging just makes time go faster. Start with the math, because the math is unsettling. In 1877, a French philosopher named Paul Janet proposed something that sounds simple until you work out the implications. Each period of time you experience is perceived as a proportion of all the time you have experienced so far. When you were 5, 1 year was 20% of your entire life, 1/5 of everything you had ever known. Massive, heavy, endless. At 50, 1 year is 2%. At 70, 1.4%. The subjective weight of a year shrinks logarithmically as the denominator grows. Plot this on a graph and the curve is startling. Subjectively, measured not in clock time, but in experience proportion. Your life is approximately half over by the time you reach 18 to 20 years old. You experience as much subjective duration between birth and your 20th birthday as you will experience in all the remaining decades combined. The decades from 20 to 80, which contain most of your career, your marriage, your children growing up, your grandchildren, your retirement, all of that, taken together, occupies the same subjective space as the first 2 decades occupied alone. I find this the most disorienting result in the psychology of time. Not because it is wrong, the math is straightforward and the subjective experience confirms it, but because it means that the years you are living right now, the years that feel like they are disappearing, are not malfunctioning. They are doing exactly what the math predicts. Each one weighs less because the denominator beneath it is larger. The feeling that time is accelerating is the feeling of a logarithmic curve, steep at the beginning, flattening as it extends. You are living on the flat part of the curve. The years are all there, they just weigh less. Verify this against your own experience. The decade between 10 and 20, adolescence, high school, first love, first independence, felt longer than the decade between 50 and 60. Not because more happened, because each year in that earlier decade weighed more against the total. The year you were 12 was 8% of your life. The year you were 55 was less than 2%. The same 365 days, experienced through a nervous system that assigns proportional weight automatically, felt 4 times longer at 12 than at 55. That summer when you were 7, the one that felt like it lasted a year, was not a trick of childhood perception. It was proportionally enormous relative to everything you had experienced before it. A single summer at age 7 is roughly 4% of your total lived experience. A summer at age 70 is roughly 0.3%, 13 times smaller in proportional weight. The same 90 days, measured against a different denominator. Last year, the one that disappeared in what felt like 3 months, was a thin sliver of accumulated experience laid on top of a mountain of prior years. The 365 days were all there. You lived every one of them. But proportionally, they weighed almost nothing against the decades that came before. Janet's ratio is not the complete explanation, but it is the mathematical framework that everything else builds on. Time itself does not accelerate. Your yardstick for measuring it keeps getting longer. A second explanation is neurological, and it involves the speed of your brain's camera. In 2019, Adrian Bejan, a mechanical engineer at Duke University who spent his career studying flow systems and thermodynamic optimization, turned his attention to a question that seemed far from engineering. Why does time feel faster as you age? Bejan's answer came from physics rather than psychology. As the brain ages, the speed at which it processes visual and cognitive information decreases. The cause is physical, myelin, the fatty insulation sheath that wraps nerve fibers and determines how fast electrical signals travel along them, degrades with age. Neural pathways become more complex, with more branching points and longer routes between processing centers. The density of neural connections in some regions decreases. The result is that each conscious moment, each frame of experience, takes slightly longer to assemble. When you were 7, your brain processed more frames per unit of clock time, more snapshots per minute, more discrete moments of awareness per hour. The experience of each day was richer, denser, more granular, packed with more individual moments of conscious perception than the same day contains now. At 70, the frame rate has slowed. Each second of clock time contains fewer mental snapshots. Fewer discrete moments of awareness are assembled per minute. The day contains the same 24 hours, but fewer conscious frames are rendered within those hours. Time feels faster because each moment is thinner. Less perceptual content is being generated per unit of external time. Feynman used an analogy that makes the physics concrete. A camera shooting at 60 frames per second records a minute of footage that, when played back at normal speed, looks smooth, rich, and detailed. Every micro-expression caught, every movement fluid. A camera shooting at 10 frames per second records the same minute, but the playback looks faster, choppier, less complete. The information density per unit of time has decreased. Your brain at 7 was the 60-frame camera. Your brain at 70 is closer to 10. The minute did not change. The recording equipment did. This is not metaphor. Feynman published the physics in the European Review, grounding it in measurable changes. Saccadic eye movement frequency decreases with age. Saccades are the rapid, involuntary eye movements that scan the visual field, jumping from fixation point to build a coherent image of the world. A young brain generates more saccades per second, more sampling points, more data collected, more visual frames assembled. An aging brain generates fewer. The number of fixation points, the visual system samples per second, drops measurably across decades. The speed at which the brain assembles a coherent perceptual moment from raw sensory data slows. Every measurement points in the same direction. Fewer moments of conscious experience are assembled per unit of clock time as the brain ages. Experience of this decline is subtle but pervasive. You do not feel each individual frame being lost. You do not notice the processing speed declining on any given day. What you notice, looking back across months and years, is that time seems to have accelerated, that the same amount of clock time contains less experienced life than it used to. A day at 70 feels shorter than a day at 7, not because fewer hours passed, but because fewer perceptual moments were assembled within those hours. The clock on the wall runs at the same speed. The clock inside your head runs slower, and the discrepancy between the two is what you experience as time speeding up. Dopamine compounds the structural decline. Your brain's internal timing system, the striatal cortical circuit that generates the subjective sense of seconds passing, is modulated by dopamine. Higher dopamine speeds up the internal clock, more ticks per second, more subjective duration per unit of clock time. Lower dopamine slows it. Dopamine production declines roughly 10% per decade after age 20. By 70, the system is operating at roughly half its youthful capacity. Structural slowing from myelin degradation and chemical slowing from dopamine decline operate simultaneously. Fewer perceptual frames assembled per second and fewer internal clock ticks registered within each frame. The combined effect is that a minute at 70 contains dramatically less subjective experience than a minute at 20. Pharmacological evidence confirms the dopamine role directly. Stimulant drugs that increase dopamine make time feel slower, while dopamine-depleting conditions like Parkinson's disease make time feel faster. Patients consistently underestimate elapsed durations because their internal clock cannot keep pace with external time. The experience of this combined decline is the feeling that afternoons are shorter than they used to be, that an hour of reading passes in what feels like 20 minutes, that you look at the clock expecting 3 in the afternoon and it is already 5. The external time was all there. Your internal processing, structural and chemical, ran slower within it. Memory provides the third explanation, and it reveals something you can act on. David Eagleman, a neuroscientist who has spent years studying time perception, argues that the brain does not have a clock that directly measures duration. Instead, it estimates how long a period lasted by counting the density of memories encoded during that period. Dense memories, packed with sensory detail, emotional weight, contextual richness, make a period feel long in retrospect. Sparse memories make it feel short. The brain reconstructs the experience of duration after the fact, using memory as its ruler. Novelty is the key mechanism. Your hippocampus. The memory structure that tags experiences for detailed long-term encoding is activated by new information. When something is genuinely novel, a place you have never been, a food you have never tasted, a conversation that takes a turn you did not expect, the hippocampus flags it for rich encoding. Sensory details, spatial context, emotional valence, temporal markers. Everything gets recorded in high resolution. The memory is thick. When something is routine, the same drive to the same store along the same road, the same breakfast, the same evening in the same chair, the basal ganglia processes it on autopilot. The hippocampus barely activates. Almost nothing gets stored. The experience passes through your awareness and vanishes. Not because it was unimportant, but because the brain's encoding system classified it as already known and declined to record it. The efficiency is remarkable and, for time perception, devastating. The more predictable your days, the fewer of them your brain preserves. A year of identical days, no matter how pleasant, compresses in memory to almost nothing, because the brain recorded one template and discarded the repetitions. Childhood was saturated with novelty. First day of school, first bicycle ride without the training wheels, first thunderstorm experienced alone, first time the math problem clicked, first betrayal by a friend, first meal in a restaurant where you ordered for yourself, first time you stayed up past dark and the world looked different. Every week held genuinely new events, and the hippocampus recorded every one of them in lavish detail. Full sensory encoding, spatial context, emotional markers, temporal tags. Looking back, those weeks feel enormous. They are packed with encoded memory. The subjective sense of duration is thick because the memory trace is thick. Routine adulthood is different. Monday's neural encoding is indistinguishable from Friday's. The commute was the same. The meals were similar. The evening routine varied by what was on television, but not by anything the hippocampus would classify as genuinely new information requiring detailed encoding. The week collapses in memory to a single compressed representation, not 5 distinct days but one generic weekday repeated. The month collapses to a few moments. The year becomes a handful of events, a birthday, a holiday, a trip, surrounded by empty space where experience occurred but was never recorded. The empty space is not time that was wasted. It is time that was lived, but not filed. This is why a vacation feels long in two different ways, and understanding both directions reveals the encoding mechanism clearly. While you are on vacation, novelty forces moment-to-moment encoding that makes each day feel full and unhurried. Every meal is in a new restaurant. Every street is unfamiliar. Every conversation includes details the brain has never processed. Time slows because the brain is assembling more conscious frames per hour, more data to process, more hippocampal encoding, more perceptual moments rendered. In retrospect, the vacation feels even longer than it felt while you were living it, because the memory trace is dense. More encoded moments to count when the brain estimates how much time passed. Routine weeks at home produce the opposite effect in both directions. While you are living it, the familiar environment generates fewer perceptual moments per hour. The basal ganglia handles most of the processing without hippocampal involvement. Time feels like it is passing at normal speed or even quickly. In retrospect, the week feels like nothing because it was never fully recorded. The days happened. Your brain declined to file them. The week that felt ordinary while you lived it feels like it barely existed when you look back. A paradox sharpens the mechanism. Time perception is not one phenomenon, it is two. There is the experience of duration in the present moment. how fast or slow time feels right now. And there is the retrospective estimation of duration, how long a period feels when you look back on it. Novelty expands both. Routine compresses both. And the compression is what produces the sensation that years are vanishing. Because the retrospective estimate, the backward-looking assessment of how much life a period contained, is built entirely from encoded memories. No memories, no sense of duration. The year was not shorter. It was emptier. Deep absorption in a challenging task can suppress the sense of time passing in the moment, while simultaneously producing the dense encoding that makes the period feel substantial in retrospect, which confirms that retrospective fullness depends on encoding depth, not on how fast the minutes felt while you were living them. Eagleman's finding has a practical implication that is worth pausing on. The disappearance of time is partly a recording failure, not a physics inevitability. The brain that is not encountering novelty is not encoding memories. The memories that are not encoded cannot be counted when the brain estimates how much life has passed. Eagleman demonstrated this with an experiment that made the mechanism vivid. He dropped subjects from a 150-foot platform into a safety net, a controlled free fall lasting roughly 3 seconds. The subjects consistently reported that the fall felt much longer than 3 seconds. Time seemed to slow during the terror of the drop. Eagleman had the subjects wear a device on their wrists that flashed numbers at a speed too fast for normal perception to read. He wanted to know whether time actually slowed, whether the brain was genuinely processing faster during the fall, or whether the retrospective estimate of duration was inflated by the dense memory encoding that fear and novelty produced. The subjects could not read the fast flashing numbers. Their brains were not actually processing faster during the fall. But when asked afterward how long the fall lasted, they consistently overestimated by roughly 36%. The explanation, the extreme novelty and fear of the fall, produced extraordinarily dense hippocampal encoding. Every millisecond was recorded in rich detail because the brain classified the experience as maximally survival, relevant. When the brain later estimated duration by counting encoded moments, it counted more moments than 3 seconds usually contain and concluded the fall must have lasted longer. Time did not slow during the fall. The memory of the fall was so dense that the brain, looking back, calculated that more time must have passed than actually did. Sit with that finding for a moment. The brain cannot measure time directly. It can only count what it recorded. And when the recording is dense, the brain concludes that more time must have passed. The ruler is made of memory. The denser the memory, the longer the ruler reads. Scale it down from a 150-foot drop to your daily life. The novel afternoon encodes densely. Looking back, the brain counts the dense memory and estimates that a substantial amount of time passed. The routine afternoon encodes sparsely. Looking back, the brain counts almost nothing and estimates that barely any time passed. Same number of hours. Different encoding. Different retrospective experience of how much life those hours contained. Time did not slow during the fall. The brain did not gain extra processing speed. What happened is that the encoding density increased so dramatically that the retrospective estimate of duration expanded to match the number of recorded moments. The brain's only way to measure past time is to count how much was recorded, and the fall produced more recording per second than ordinary life produces per minute. This is the same mechanism operating in reverse across your adult years. Routine produces thin encoding. Thin encoding produces short retrospective estimates. Short retrospective estimates produce the sensation that time vanished. The year was not shorter. It was recorded at lower resolution. Attention determines what gets encoded. When your attention is divided, multitasking, scrolling through a phone while half watching television, listening to a conversation while composing a text, the hippocampus does not encode. The experience passes through your perception without being committed to memory. Looking back, it feels like it never happened. Not because it was unimportant, because the divided attention prevented the encoding that would have preserved it. Concentrated, undivided attention on a single thing. Reading a book with your phone in another room, Having a conversation where you are fully present, watching a sunset without documenting it, listening to music as the primary activity rather than background, working on a project that absorbs you completely, produces dense hippocampal encoding and, in retrospect, makes that time feel full and substantial. The minutes were the same length. The attention determined whether they were recorded or discarded. You have experienced this difference directly. An hour spent in genuine conversation with someone you care about, fully present, tracking their words, responding from thought rather than habit, feels longer in memory than 3 hours of scrolling through a phone. A morning spent learning something new, a language, an instrument, a skill, feels like it contained more life than a week of routine repetition. The clock measured the same time. The hippocampus recorded vastly different amounts. Modern life is an attention fragmentation machine. The 24-hour news cycle, the notification stream, the infinite scroll, these systems are specifically designed to capture partial attention continuously rather than full attention periodically. The phone in your pocket is an encoding disruptor. Every notification that pulls your gaze away from whatever you were doing interrupts the hippocampal encoding process. The memory that was forming dissolves. The moment that was being recorded gets overwritten by the notification's content, which itself is too brief and too familiar in format to trigger detailed encoding. Two experiences destroyed, the one you were having and the one that interrupted it, neither one preserved. The result is the worst possible combination for time perception. Constant distraction that prevents deep encoding of whatever you were doing, combined with shallow stimulation that the hippocampus does not bother to record. Hours of perceived activity that produce almost no encoded memory. An evening of scrolling feels like it lasted 20 minutes because the hippocampus encoded almost nothing. The content was too fragmented, too familiar in format, too rapidly replaced to trigger detailed encoding. An evening of reading a novel with full attention feels like it contained the whole night because the sustained narrative produced continuous hippocampal engagement. Characters, settings, emotional responses, plot developments, all encoded in sequence. Same number of hours. Vastly different amounts of life recorded. For anyone who feels that years are disappearing, that entire months leave no trace, that the distance between January and December has compressed to almost nothing, the physics points to two specific levers. Novelty forces encoding. Every genuinely new experience, a route you have never driven, a book by an author you have never read, a conversation about a topic you have never explored, a recipe you have never attempted, a place you have never visited, even if it is 10 minutes from your house, activates the hippocampus and produces a dense memory trace. The experience is recorded at high resolution. In retrospect, it expands the subjective sense of how much time passed. The novelty does not need to be dramatic. It does not require travel or expense or physical exertion. It requires only that the input be unfamiliar enough that the hippocampus classifies it as new information worth preserving. Walking a different route through your own neighborhood counts. Listening to a genre of music you have never explored counts. Having a conversation with someone about a subject neither of you has discussed before counts. Reading about a field you know nothing about counts. The threshold for novelty is low. The encoding reward is high. Attention determines resolution. The same novel experience, performed while distracted, encodes at lower density than the same experience performed with full attention. Novelty provides the raw material. Attention determines how much of it gets preserved. Janet's proportional effect cannot be reversed. At 70, a year will always weigh less against the accumulated total than it did at 7. The frame rate cannot be fully restored. Myelin degradation is a physical process. The dopamine decline is gradual and largely beyond direct control, though sustained physical activity does increase dopamine receptor availability. But the recording system responds to input. The hippocampus does not care how old you are. It cares whether the input is novel. It cares whether attention is present. Give it both, a new experience and your full awareness. And it encodes at a density that makes that hour feel in memory, like the hours felt when you were young. Not because time slowed down, because the brain recorded more of it. Consider what this means across a full year. A year in which you took one new route per week, read one unfamiliar book per month, had one genuinely new conversation per week, visited one place you had never been per month, even places near home, and did all of it with your phone in your pocket rather than your hand. That year would contain roughly 200 novel experiences encoded at high hippocampal resolution, each one expanding the retrospective sense of how much life the year contained. Compare that to a year of identical weeks processed on autopilot with divided attention, a year that compresses in memory to a handful of holidays and a blur. The clock measured the same 365 days. The hippocampus recorded vastly different amounts. One year feels, looking back, like it contained a life. The other feels like it barely happened. You cannot make a year at 70 weigh as much as a year at 7. Janet's math prevents that. You cannot restore the frame rate of a 7-year-old brain. Bejan's physics prevents that. You cannot reverse 5 decades of dopamine decline. But you can determine how much of each remaining year gets recorded. The hippocampus is waiting for input it has not seen before. The encoding system is intact. The only question is whether you give it something to encode. That summer when you were 7 lasted forever because every day held something your brain had never processed before, and you gave it your complete attention because you had nothing else to give. No phone, no notification stream, no divided awareness. Just the creek, the frog, the argument, the slow dissolve of daylight. Every detail encoded by a hippocampus that was encountering the world for the first time and recording everything. The year that just disappeared was full of days your brain had seen before, processed on autopilot by basal ganglia that recognized the pattern and declined to involve the hippocampus, while your attention was distributed across 6 things at once. None of them encoded at the depth that would make them persist in memory. Every day was the same length. They always were. What changed is what your brain did with them. And part of that, not all of it, but a meaningful part, is still yours to decide.